to everyone who has joined us today. I'm really looking forward to sharing the information about the ancient Egyptian afterlife with you. So I am just going to begin by sharing my screen, and we will start the slideshow from the beginning. Always a good place to start. I'll also just pick up my trusted pointer. There we go. So our talk today, Mummies and Maps, how to get to the ancient Egyptian afterlife. Now, the ancient Egyptians had a very complex and nuanced understanding of the afterlife, and mummification was only a part of this. So today we're going to find out about what the ancient Egyptians believed would happen on their journey to the afterlife and what it was like when you arrived there. Now, while it's often assumed that the ancient Egyptians were obsessed with death, since they appear to have directed a lot of money, labour and time into preparing for it, they actually loved life so much they did all they could to prolong it, convinced of reaching an eternal existence, which was an idealised version of their earthly life. Now, in addition, the idea of ancient Egypt and death is something which often comes across in narratives at the museum, due to the fact that a lot of our evidence for ancient Egypt comes from tombs. So a great proportion of the material on exhibition in museums are mummies and objects which have been recovered from tombs. And we're going to be using some of these to give us an insight into ancient Egyptian concepts of the afterlife. What I'd like to do is start by just saying that, of course, we need to remember that when we talk about ancient Egypt, we're actually talking about an incredibly long period of history. And very often when people hear the words ancient Egypt, or a television program comes up and it's sort of the secrets of ancient Egypt or lost mysteries of ancient Egypt, it will usually be concentrated around this middle section, in particular around what is known as the New Kingdom. This was the period of ancient Egyptian history when Tutankhamun reigned. But this period is only a small part of the chronology of human settlement within the Nile Valley, going back to prehistoric Egypt, then the beginnings of unified rule across the whole of the Nile Valley, then into the kingdoms which we often think about when we hear about ancient Egypt. So the Old Kingdom, which was the time of the pyramids, then into the Middle Kingdom, the New Kingdom, of course, remembering that all of these divisions have been placed upon ancient Egyptian history by modern archaeologists and historians. This is not how the ancient Egyptians would have thought of their history. It's our way of dividing up the history. Then going into the late period, through to the Ptolemaic period. This is the time of Cleopatra VII, who was the last Egyptian pharaoh, before Egypt then became part of the Roman Empire. So with this in mind, we also need to remember that ideas of what happened in the afterlife and how you travel to that afterlife evolved and changed across the whole period of Egypt, from the Old Kingdom into the New Kingdom. And what we are looking at today will be a lot of objects from the New Kingdom period, which really are a snapshot of what people believed at that time. Now, a lot of these beliefs then carry forward into the late period Ptolemaic and indeed into Roman Egypt, and we still have mummification occurring during Roman Egypt. The great break in this belief system occurs with the arrival of other faiths in Egypt, principally the Christian faith. By AD 200, Alexandria was a centre of Christian learning and scholarship, and then later the Islamic faith. So we are going to be looking at the New Kingdom, which is where many of our objects come from. They are all from the British Museum collections, and we are going to begin with one of our mummies. Now, the focus of our talk today is on what happened after you were mummified. So we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about the process of mummification, but we can say that mummification is what we refer to as a process of preserving a body after death by deliberately embalming it. And in ancient Egyptian times, these mummified bodies were then placed in tombs with associated funerary objects. Now, mummification was typically reserved for the top 1% of society. So royalty, nobility, government officials, and the wealthy. Because the practice was expensive, common people were rarely mummified. So people such as myself, had I been alive in ancient Egypt, would have been buried in a cemetery on the edge of the desert landscape in the Nile Valley. So when we look at mummified remains and when we look at objects from tombs in museum collections, we're looking at objects which really give us direct evidence for the top 1% of Egyptian society, but also then reflect ideas that would have permeated the whole population in Egyptian society. This particular coffin has no name painted on it. It dates to around 900 BC, but the X-rays which have been taken of the coffin and the mummified body show that it is a middle-aged woman. And after dying, the soft tissues would have been dried using natron, a type of natural salt dug from the Egyptian desert. Her body would then have been treated with resins, adorned with amulets and jewelry, wrapped in linen, and placed in a coffin. And this was the first stage of a person's journey to eternal afterlife. A journey which is captured in objects found alongside bodies in the tomb. And in particular today, we're going to be looking at one type of object placed in tombs, which was a papyrus roll known today as the Book of the Dead. And this is the name used for a manuscript placed in the tomb to help their dead on their journey through the underworld to the afterlife. Now, the original Egyptian name for the text translates as Book of Coming Forth by Day, or Book of Emerging Forth into the Light. They were made from papyrus, a type of reed sheeting, and the rolls ranged in length from a few meters to over 30 meters. When completed, they were rolled, often placed inside a hollow statue, and went into the tomb with the mummy. The rolls contained illustrations and written text, and we can see on this example here, which is a sheet from the Book of the Dead of a man called Hunifer, who we see here illustrated to the left, together with his wife, Nasha. And this text in front of them is often referred to nowadays as a set of spells. They are magical sayings, incantations, which give information that the person will need to know as they journey through the afterlife and meet particular situations and answer particular questions, which we'll be looking at later in today's talk. At present, about 192 spells are known, though no single roll contains all of them. And the Book of the Dead gave the deceased the knowledge and power to travel through the Netherworld. And this was the place the dead went immediately after death. And then to enter the afterlife. That was the final destination of their journey. They didn't need to read it beforehand. Just having one in your tomb was enough. Some people commissioned their own Book of the Dead, perhaps choosing the spells they thought most vital to their progress to the afterlife. Others would purchase a pre-written scroll into which their name was added. They're usually written in hieroglyphs or hieratic script. Hieratic is a type of joined up handwritten hieroglyph, and illustrated with scenes showing the deceased and their journey into the afterlife. So here we see Hunifer and Nasha at the start of the journey, worshipping a range of gods who they are going to encounter during the journey to the afterlife. And that journey began on the day of the funeral. And this was seen as the point where the dead person moved from the world of the living to the world of the dead. And we see the funeral of Annie captured here in his Book of the Dead, which was recovered from his tomb at Thebes and dates to around 1250 BC. And the inscriptions in the Book of the Dead give us information about Annie's position within society and reinforce the idea that an object of this sort of quality could only be afforded by the most wealthy in society. So he is spoken of as a scribe and overseer of the double granary of the Lord of Tower. We know the name of his wife. She is also named in the Book of the Dead. She is called Tutu. And her titles include Lady of the House and Chantress of Amun, which means that she served as a priestess, a singer at a temple in Thebes. And here we can see that the day of the funeral was the day when the mummy was placed into the tomb. And the ancient Egyptians believed that when a person died, their spiritual essence survived. And it was this spiritual essence which traveled through the underworld before being judged by Osiris, the god of the dead. So after mummification, this body has been taken to the tomb in a funeral procession. And in this scene, the mummified body has arrived immediately in front of its final resting place, a stylized image of a tomb which would have been cut into the rocky hillside around the ancient city of Thebes. To the far left, we have porters who are carrying objects to be placed in the tomb for the person to use in the afterlife. In the middle, we have what is probably a group of paid mourners who are wailing and crying. And on the right, we have the priests who are performing a ceremony called the opening of the mouth. Now, just a couple of things I'd like to note here before we go on to look at some more Book of the Dead illustrations is a couple of things about ancient Egyptian art. First of all, people are usually shown in full profile, and objects which are being shown are shown with the objects themselves peeping out of the top of the box. So if we look at the porters, you can see the boxes they are carrying appear to have objects spilling out of them. When we then go across to the right and we look at the offerings, the food offerings, it appears to be a pile of food offerings. And what we need to remember is that for the ancient Egyptians, showing something made it so. So if you show something, it will happen, it will be there. So what you don't want to do is to just show the outside of the box, because that would give you an empty box. So your illustrations shows the box and what in reality would be the contents tucked away out of sight, because both being visible means both are there. So this pile of offerings was probably laid out horizontally, but is shown vertically, almost as if you're hovering above the table looking down, so that everything that is going into the tomb is visible, and thus everything visible will go into the tomb. We also see standing behind the mummy a priest wearing a mask of Anubis, Anubis being the god of mummification. I'm going to meet him again later. So the priests that we saw in Annie's Book of the Dead are shown here again in another scene from Hunefer's Book of the Dead. And here we can see that the priests are performing what is known as the opening of the mouth ceremony. And during this ceremony, the priests are going to touch the eyes, ears, mouth and nostrils of the mummy with ritual tools. And we can see them holding these up in the air, ready to touch the mummy. And this would mean that the mummy was able to see, hear, breathe and speak in both the netherworld and the afterlife. Now here, the officiating priest, clad in a panther skin, is offering incense, and I rather like the way that you can see there's little lines coming out of the top of the block of incense to suggest the smell dissipating through the air, and also purifying with water as he stands beside a pile of offerings. Other priests offer containers and raise ritual implements to Hunefer's mummy, which again is held up by a priest representing Anubis, the god of embalming. Now, what we can see below are two sets of opening of the mouth ceremonial tools. They're models, they're small scale models of what would have been used on the day of the funeral. And they were found in a tomb at Abydos, and they date to around 2300 BC. And you can see here on the right that there are a set of crystal and obsidian vessels, and these would have contained the oils that would have been used as part of the ceremony. And there is also a small replica object in the center made from pink limestone, which represents one of the ritual objects that would have been used to touch the mummy's face to enable it to speak, hear, smell and see in the afterlife. And next to it, another object found in Abydos. This is a small calcite tablet, and this lists a set of different oils that would have been used during the ceremony. So here are the names of the oils, and then a little well, which would have then held that particular oil, ready, I suspect, for a tool to be dipped in to be placed on the mummy. Now, Hunefer, who we also see in another part of the same sheet from his Book of the Dead, has arrived in his tomb and is now getting ready for his journey through the afterlife. And he's placing the hieroglyphic sign for the west in two different directions, indicating his ability to roam at will through the netherworld. He's also shown seated in a booth, playing a board game, and this is the board game known as Senet. It's a racing game with two players, two sets of counters, and a board consisting of 3 rows of squares that each player has to progress through, and the first person to get all their players to the end is the winner. And this game is often shown in Book of the Dead, and it's partly to ensure his continued enjoyment of this pleasure pursuit, given what we've just said, that if it appears, it will be there. So make it so that I will be able to enjoy playing Senet in the afterlife. Here is an image of me doing that in my Book of the Dead. But it also symbolises victory over the obstacles that are going to prevent his entry to the afterlife. So it is suggesting that he's going to use strategy and knowledge to complete his journey, in the same way that he would use strategy and gamesmanship to win his game of Senet. And then on the far right, we have a barbird. And a barbird is the next stage of the journey that we are going to meet. Here we come to a papyrus from Annie's Book of the Dead, so a scene from his scroll, and it shows his mummy lying in the tomb with his barbird above it. And the other image we have on the screen, it's the end wall, so it's the end side of a Shaddi box. And what's of interest to us is that this shows a goddess, probably Amunet, who welcomed the dead on the beginning of their journey into the afterlife with food and drink. She lived in a tree near the gates of the underworld, and she is known as She of the West. And we know that she was the wife of the divine ferryman, and we'll meet ferry journeys later on. And she was also the daughter of the goddess Hathor and the god Horus. And here we see her leaning out of her tree. She holds food in her arm and pours with her other hand water, which flows down to the owner of the tomb, but also flows down to the owner of the tomb's bar bird. So both the owner of the tomb in their human form and part of their spiritual essence, their bar bird, are being sustained by the goddess, ready for their journey through the afterworld. Now, the ancient Egyptians believed that a human soul was made up of many parts, including their spiritual body, their shadow, their name, and their personality. And in life, the person was a complete entity. But at the point of death, these component parts broke apart, rather like a glass being dropped on the floor and shattering into smaller pieces. But all of these components would need to travel to the afterlife, where they would be reunited for eternity. One element was the bar, and a bar was the part of your personality that made you unique, made you who you were. And the bar is usually shown as a human-headed bird, which could leave the body, as we see here with the bar bird above Annie's mummy, and travel through the Netherworld. Now, once it left the safety of the tomb, it needed to be cautious, because if it was damaged in any way, it would forget where to return to, and that part of the soul would be destroyed and would be doomed to wander aimlessly forevermore. So the reunion of all the component parts of the person, including their preserved bone, tissue, and skin, represented by the mummy, was necessary for successful entry to the afterlife. Our next Book of the Dead is known as the Greenfield Papyrus, and it shows the journey of an ancient Egyptian called Nesta Tabet Tashru. And in this particular scene, we see her accompanied by her bar bird, about to start her journey to the afterlife. She was the daughter of the high priest of Amun at Thebes, about 970 BC. And her particular Book of the Dead is one of the longest to have survived. It was originally over 37 meters long. It's now been cut into 96 separate sheets and mounted between glass. And we can see an example of one of those sheets as it appears in the British Museum storerooms to the right. So originally a long roll. When these Book of the Dead were acquired by the museum, usually Victorian period, they would then be cut into pages in a way that more resembled the Western European notion of a book with pages. And they were then stored between glass sheets because they're incredibly fragile. Now, nowadays, often perspex is used for storage in museums, but the British Museum still has its Book of the Dead sheets stored between glass. The reason being that if for any dreadful reason the glass with the Book of the Dead sheet was dropped, glass breaks more cleanly than perspex. And the other thing is that perspex, because it has an ability to attract static electricity, when it breaks, it will often tear apart the papyrus inside, because the papyrus adheres to the perspex, whereas with glass, even though the glass will shatter into many small pieces, it doesn't adhere to the papyrus that it is supporting, and therefore you actually get less damage to the papyrus, more damage to the glass, which is the way round we want it. So this particular scene shows us that as a member of the ruling elite in Thebes, she would have been provided with very high quality funerary equipment, and many of the spells in her papyrus are illustrated. So this would have cost more than a Book of the Dead composed mostly of texts. The addition of images and illustrations supporting the written text requires more labour, requires different skills, and therefore costs more money. And her papyrus also includes several large illustrations depicting important scenes. The deceased and her barbird are shown adoring, worshipping the god Ra Harakni, and a judge of the Netherworld. Here we see one of the judges sitting behind Ra. We'll come across these judges again later, and they are easy to spot because of the way they are portrayed, looking as if they are sitting with their knees tucked up before them. There is also an offering table and a falcon on a standard to the right. And the hieroglyphic text tells us a bit more about her life around Thebes, and it tells her that she was the first leader-in-chief of the musicians of Amun. She was a priestess of Amun Ra, and she was also a servant of the archives of Amun Rason Thur. So that's interesting that that seems to suggest that as well as a ceremonial role within the temple to Amun at Thebes, that she also has an additional role in terms of the objects, and particularly the papyruses that are stored at the temple as part of the working, the administration of the temple. The papyrus itself is named after Edith Mary Greenfield, who donated it to the British Museum in May 1910. Having entered the Netherworld, having started their journey, the first part of the journey is often shown as having to approach a series of gates. And the ancient Egyptians believed that actually there were gates, doors and pylons that they would have to cross every night during their journey through the Netherworld. And every gate was guarded by a minor god, and we can see a variety of these minor gods shown sitting, guarding their individual gates, which are being approached by Ani and his wife Tutu. And to access the next part of the journey, to move through the gate, they would have to be capable of pronouncing, of speaking out loud, the secret name of each of the gods. The deceased would have to declare, "Make way for me, since I know you. I know your name. I know the name of the god who guards you." This information is very helpfully shown in the hieroglyphs that surround each of the gates. So the hieroglyphs next to the gate in your Book of the Dead give you the answer and give you the name that you need to speak so you can pacify the guardian and continue on your journey. And once pacified, these guardian gods were deemed as posing no further threat and would often extend their protection to the dead person as they continued their journey. So again, this reinforces the idea that the Book of the Dead is another example of the make it so part of the Egyptian cognitive world. So Ani does not have to memorize these names. By having the Book of the Dead in the tomb, his barbird and the different aspects of his soul have access to all the information they need for their journey through the afterworld. And to speak the name of each god, they simply access the text around the gate and they can then pass on. Now, the Netherworld is often known as the Duet, and that is the name for the realm of the dead in ancient Egyptian mythology. It was ruled by the god Osiris, lord of the underworld, and he was also the first mummy as described in the Osiris myth, and he personified rebirth and life after death. And when you see representations of Osiris, he is sometimes shown with a green skin to represent this idea of rebirth, like the growing of new plants from seeds, rebirth, regrowing, regeneration. Now, the geography of the Duet, the Netherworld, was similar to that of the world that the Egyptians knew. There were realistic features, so they expected to encounter rivers, which often had islands in them, fields, lakes, mountains, and also caverns. And in addition to all these realistic geographical features, they expected that they would have to travel through or round lakes of fire, walls of iron, and trees of turquoise. And the Book of the Dead includes a set of spells known nowadays as the transformation spells. And these allowed you to transform into different animals so that you could navigate these natural and imaginary obstacles. So, for example, spell 98 to 99 allowed the deceased person to use ferry boats in the underworld, and this would allow them to cross any watery parts of the underworld landscape. In addition, the celestial ferryman was a rude and unpleasant character who needed to be pacified to ensure a smooth journey. So again, there was information available, knowledge that you could speak that would enable you to make use of the celestial ferryman as you journeyed through the underworld. And successful completion of your journey through the Netherworld would bring you to the Hall of Mat. And this was the place where, having completed the journey, you then were judged by Osiris and the gods to determine whether you were suitable to be admitted to the afterlife. So this was the final great test of your journey, having passed through all the different gates, having negotiated the landscape of the Netherworld, having used spells to protect you against demons, having used spells to enable you to transform into different animals so that you could more successfully negotiate the landscape of the underworld. You now came to the point of judgment, the final test. And this is probably one of the most famous scenes from the Book of the Dead, the judgment scene. And this is usually the part of the journey from funeral to eventual afterlife that people are most familiar with. And we're going to start exploring this in the second part of our talk. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, during which I'm going to leave up on the screen this judgment scene from Annie's Book of the Dead. So here we see Annie with his wife holding a sistrum, a ritual instrument rather like a tambourine, often played during music and worship in temples. So it's giving us a suggestion that she may have worked as a musician or a singer in a temple as a priestess. And we're going to interrogate in greater detail the different parts of this scene to find out the details of the moment of judgment. So we're going to take a 10-minute break, and I will see you back here to find out whether Annie is going to successfully pass his test. See you in 10 minutes. Hello, welcome back. And I hope you've enjoyed having a look at what is probably one of the finest representations that we currently know of the point of judgment. This one being the point of judgment for Ani, having completed his journey through the Netherworld, hoping to be welcomed by Osiris into eternal life in the afterlife. And here he is in the Hall of Mat, waiting to be judged. He stands here slightly bowed forward with his fist placed against his shoulder in a mark of respect to the gods who wait to judge him. And we can see some of the gods waiting to judge him sitting here at the top of the scene, including Ra Hanakri, and also here Isis and her sister Nephres, and behind them the god Horus. Now, Osiris at the point of judgment was advised by 42 minor gods, and they helped to judge how the dead person had led their life. And examples of what was considered good and bad behaviour in ancient Egypt are known from books of instruction. So good behaviour was seen to maintain the balance of society and show reverence to the gods by paying respect to senior figures, supporting the less fortunate, and observing ritual practice in temples. The person was expected to arrive for the judgment wearing clean, fresh clothes, wearing white sandals, painted with eye paint and anointed with the finest oil of myrrh. And on arrival, they had to answer a series of questions. And as you would expect, these questions and answers are included in the Book of the Dead text. An example being Thoth, who we see here standing to the right, the god of writing and mathematics and medicine, acting here as the scribe for the judgment, asks, "Why have you come?" To which Ani announces, "To be announced. What is your condition? I am free of every sin. To whom shall I announce you? To him whose ceiling is fire, whose walls are living sacred serpents, whose house floor is the flood. Who is that? Osiris." The deceased then asserted their good character to Osiris and the 42 assessors, each of whom had to be addressed by their name, and each of whom was considered to be responsible for a particular offence. So, for example, Ani might address one of them as "Swallower of shades, who came forth from the cavern, I have not stolen." So the first part of the judgment process is that Ani has to assert verbally that he has not committed any bad or evil deeds during his life. And then as part of this judgment process, his heart is weighed on a set of scales against the feather of truth. So here we see the scales. We see Anubis just adjusting sort of the plumb line weight to make sure they're balanced correctly. And then on the scales, we see Ani's heart. And we know that the heart was one of the organs that was not removed from the body during mummification. The heart was seen as the essence of the person, containing all knowledge of their life, and therefore would be weighed against the goddess Mat's feather of truth to show if they were free from evil, in which case the heart would balance with the feather of truth, and they would be declared true of voice and admitted to the afterlife. If their heart was full of heavy deeds and weighed heavier than the feather of truth, it would be thrown to the figure we see here at the far right, who is Amit, the devourer. She was a creature composed of fierce creatures from the real ancient Egyptian landscape, So we have crocodile, lion, in this case she appears to have been shown as a leopard, and a hippopotamus, and she would eat the heart, and that would mean that the person would cease to exist forever. With no heart, there was no person, and they entered nothingness forever. One of the worst fates that could befall you on your journey to the afterlife. We've already mentioned Thoth, who is acting as a secretary for Osiris and actually declaring the judgment by watching the scales. He is shown as an ibis-headed god, and the ancient Egyptians gave him the head of the river bird, an ibis, because in real life, ibis was seen sticking their beaks down into the mud to recover small creatures to eat. And this was seen as being similar to a scribe dipping their pen into an inkwell to pick up ink to write. So he is often shown with the head of an ibis bird. Anubis, as well as balancing the scales, is also there to check the outcome of the weighing. And we see standing on the other side a small figure known as Fate. So looking for Annie's fate. And here we also have, observing at close quarters, Annie's bar bird. Now, interestingly, the Book of the Dead always show the scales balanced, the ideal outcome. Because again, if it was that in your Book of the Dead, it would be that when you entered the Hall of Judgment. What is in your Book of the Dead is what will happen on your journey into the afterlife. So the ideal outcome is always shown, just to guarantee that those scales are going to balance. Now, during the judgment, the heart could speak. And the heart, of course, knew everything you had done in your life. So the Book of the Dead included a spell which ordered your heart not to speak against you, specifically saying to the heart, do not stand against me as a witness, do not oppose me in the court, do not make my name stink in front of the great god, Osiris. Now the spell could also be written on an object known as a heart scarab, and we see here one on screen, which would be placed on the body during mummification above the heart, which in effect was sitting above the heart, ordering the heart not to speak against the person. This particular heart scarab is made from basalt, and it's finely carved with the scarab beetle's head, little feathered legs, and we can see the wing case incised on the back. And underneath, we have a copy of that spell, ordering the heart not to speak against the deceased. And on this particular version, we can see that there is a space, and this is where the deceased's name would have been carved in. So it indicates that this scarab was not made for a specific burial, but purchased from stock. In fact, the person's name was never entered before it was then wrapped up as part of the linen wrapping that went around the dried body. This is a particularly fine example. There's gold foil around the edge of the scarab and also gold foil around the suspension tube, because this particular heart scarab could have been worn as a necklace. And it also was discovered with this neck ring, which is a bronze core wrapped in gold foil, one end of it shaped like a snake with a little ring hanging underneath that the other end would have been caught into, so it could be worn around the mummy's neck as part of the preparation of the body for laying in the tomb. Having successfully passed your judgment, you would then be taken forward to meet Osiris. And here we see Annie being welcomed into the afterlife by Osiris. Here's Osiris himself, shown here with his green skin to indicate regeneration, to indicate that Ani is about to be reborn into his eternal afterlife. We see that Ani is being brought forward by the god Horus, and we see the 4 sons of Horus standing on a lotus flower immediately in front of Osiris. And we know that the 4 sons of Horus had a role in protecting the organs that were stored in the tomb's canopic jar. Organs that had been removed from the body, separately dried, but were placed in the tomb so that all elements of the person's physical and spiritual body could be reunited in the afterlife. And standing behind Osiris, we have his wife Isis and his sister Nephthys. Now, the nature of the afterlife, which the dead person would enjoy, it's difficult to define due to differing traditions within ancient Egyptian religion. The dead are described as being taken into the presence of the god Osiris, who lived in the underworld, but there are also spells that would enable the dead to join the sun god Ra as he travelled on his sun barge across the sky during the day and through the underworld at night. The deceased person can be shown meeting other gods, as well as his or her own parents. So although a Book of the Dead was specific to one person, there is an indication that the idea of an afterlife is an idea not only of an afterlife which is unique to you, but also an afterlife, a bit like a Venn diagram, that has an intersection with the afterlife of your loved ones who you had known in life. One of the eventual resting places, well, I shouldn't say resting place, I should say place of living in the afterlife, is known as the Field of Reeds. And here we see the Field of Reeds represented on a number of Book of the Dead. This one here to the left is from the Book of the Dead of Nakht. This dates to around 1550 BC. We also have a Book of the Dead of Anhe, and this dates to the 20th dynasty. And then down here, a gentleman we've met several times before, this is from the Book of the Dead of Ani. And this includes spells 110 and spells 148, which speak of life in the afterlife, and specifically life in the Field of Reeds. Now, the Field of Reeds was an ideal version of the real world, with fields, crops, oxen, people, and waterways. Now, the Book of the Dead of Nakht, a royal scribe and a general in the imperial army, also named his wife and his daughter, reinforcing this idea that individual afterlives intersected with the afterlives of your family. He is shown with Thoth at the top right, and here he is with a little callback to the balancing of his heart, the day of judgment, against the feather of Mat. He then paddles his boat across the Lake of Offerings, where you can see 2 minor deities standing before a table of offerings. He's also shown worshipping the Heron of Plenty. And then we get down to reality of life in the Field of Reeds. He's shown pulling flax, reaping grains, and ploughing. And there's a little boat which we can see here, which is the boat of Osiris, moored in a side channel. And then at the other side, we can see a channel running around a small island where a group of gods sit. So a scene in a Book of the Dead is a version of continuous narrative. The person can appear multiple times, engaged in a variety of activities, which often, but not always, can be read in a graphical chronological order from the top to the bottom or from the left to the right. We see the same on the book of Anhe. So here we see her at the top, worshipping the gods. She's given the title of Chantress of Amun, leader of musicians of Osiris. Also named is her mother and her husband, and one of her husband's titles includes stable master of the residence, which implies that he worked as part of the royal court, sort of head of the stables, chief groom. And we can see her engaged in similar activities, ploughing and harvesting in the field of reeds. And then down the bottom, Annie in the afterlife, shown greeting various gods in the underworld, again paddling a boat. And here in the second register, we have him harvesting flax. And then in this one, rather than ploughing, which we see at the bottom, this one here, he's driving oxen over a threshing floor to separate the grain from the harvested stalks. And over the top of his ploughing scene, we have in hieroglyphs the title Field of Reeds. So again, this doubling up of meaning by not only showing it in drawn form, but also having it as texts. We see the field of reeds, we read that it is the field of reeds. The text guarantees the pictures guarantee the text. They have a symbiotic relationship. Now, while the field of reeds is pleasant and plentiful, manual labour, as we see, is required. And for this reason, burials would include figures known as Shabdi. And these Shabdi were inscribed with a spell requiring them to undertake any manual labour that might be the owner's duty in the afterlife. So they were intended as servants or minions for the deceased. They were marked on the front with their willingness to answer the god's summons to work. And they could be made from a wide variety of materials, and examples have been found made from terracotta, wood, stone, wax, metal, glass, but most frequently these blue-coloured shabdi, which are made from self-glazing earthenware, often referred to as Egyptian faience, which is a type of quartz mineral which was dug from the ancient Egyptian desert, which could be then moulded, mixed to make a paste and moulded a bit like Play-Doh or a very soft clay, and then baked to harden it. And during the baking, salts within the mineral rose to the surface, which gives it its blue colouring. And in fact, in the museum, there are a couple of broken shabdis, and I've seen the inside. And inside, they're just a grainy, sandy colour, and the colouring is all on the surface, which is where the salt minerals are drawn to the surface during the drying and the heating process. So they're self-colouring. Shabdis often carried a hoe on their shoulder. We see here this small shabdi with its arms crossed, carrying an agricultural implement in each hand, and a basket on their back, implying that they intended to farm for the deceased in the afterlife. So this basket on the back would have contained seeds, which the shabdi would have reached over and thrown as part of the sowing of the crops, and then later on with the agricultural implements would have harvested and processed that crop. Now, this is a particularly fine example of a little shabdi. It's covered in gold foil. Gold was believed to be the colour of the skin of the gods, so anything with a gold colouring on the face is welcoming the idea that you too would join the gods and would be golden skinned. And this particular shabdi was originally contained within a coffin, so it's got its own little coffin, which then was inside a rectangular sarcophagus, and it's inscribed on the front with spell 6 from the Book of the Dead. So this spell could be recorded in the Book of the Dead, but could also be recorded on objects in the tomb. And a shortened version of this spell reads, "O Shaddi, allotted to me, if I be summoned, or if I be detailed to do any work, here I am, you shall say." And we know that Shaddis could be present in a tomb in great numbers. And the largest number of Shaddis found in a tomb would be 401, which would give you 1 Shaddi for each day of the year, plus overseer Shaddis for each group of 10 Shaddis. So you wouldn't even have to manage your Shaddis. You would have their own little set of managers in the tomb with you. And here we see a painted Shaddi box. This person had just 8 Shaddis buried with them, 8 wooden painted Shaddis, 4 in each compartment. And these belong to Hetnetmut, and they were placed in her tomb with her mummy. And we can see them here out of the box. And what I particularly like about this photograph is not only do we have our ancient Egyptian script down the front here, spell 6, commanding the Shaddi to work, but also they've got tied on them their little museum numbers. So each Shaddi has its own individual museum number, and each of these is an object. So in fact, what we're looking at are 9 objects, the 8 Shaddi and the 1 box. And here on the box, we can see Hatshepsut with wearing a lotus flower in her hair and offering before Anubis and Osiris. And I'd now like to have a look at one of the people who we've been talking about during our talk today. One of the people who would have had the money, the position in society to be able to afford this extensive preparation and to be able to afford all of the objects that went into their expensive individual or family tomb. And here we have a limestone seated figure who we know from the hieroglyphs inscribed down the front of her dress is an ancient Egyptian called Duet. And she is shown with her husband, Mahu. Duet sits on a high back chair. She wears a long linen dress and she's got a heavy wig. And we can see that there are individual tresses in the wig. And then at the bottom, separate tighter plaits all around the bottom edge of the wig. She wears a broad collar necklace. She has 2 striped bands around her upper arms, and she has a bracelet on her right wrist. So she is dressed in her best clothing, wig, and jewelry, which is how she wishes to be seen, to be presented in the afterlife. Her left arm extends out and probably originally went behind her husband. But the statue pair were broken in 2 at an unknown point before they were acquired by the British Museum. And in fact, Duet arrived in the British Museum 2 years before her husband's statue. The inscriptions also include dedications to Theban deities, and Mahu is given the title Overseer of the Work of Amun at Karnak, while Duet is described as a priestess of Amun and Hathor. And a statue such as this would have typically sat in a tomb or a temple, and these statues were likely intended to receive offerings for the afterlife. So the process that we've been looking at today, the process that an individual ancient Egyptian believed that they would go through from the point of death to the point of eventual rebirth, was also something which your living relatives could engage with. So statues such as this may be set up inside a tomb. Ancient Egyptian tombs were often accessible. The mummies were placed in a shaft below the tomb that was sealed, but the tomb chapel itself would be accessible. And therefore relatives could go into that tomb, could offer prayers, and also could speak your name, because your name was part of your identity. So by speaking your name, by recognizing your face, by giving offerings to a statue representation of you, your family were again increasing your chances of a successful journey through the afterlife, and also ensuring your eventual rebirth, because to speak your name was to make you alive. Alive not in the living world, but alive in the afterlife, where you would live forever with the gods. So thank you very much indeed. I hope that's given you a little insight into ancient Egyptian afterlife beliefs. As I say, that is very much a drawing together of traditions from across time, which are in the form that we understand them from the New Kingdom period of Egyptian history. And if there are any questions, I would be delighted to answer them.
Thank you, Catherine. That was brilliant. So the first question I've got is, how did ordinary people, the other 99%, enter into and proceed in the afterlife?
Excellent question. Yes, the other 99%, like me, on death, we would have been buried. Mummification was very expensive and took a long time. So mummification was only available for I would have been buried in the desert, on the edge of the desert landscape either side of the River Nile, the area of the landscape that could not be used for farming, and the area of the landscape where at that time there were no settlements. All the settlements were on the banks of the River Nile, the habitable part of the Nile Valley. My body would be placed in the sand. I may have objects placed with me in my grave. My grave would then be covered over with the sand from the desert. And a couple of things would happen. First of all, someone would look after that cemetery, and that was believed to be the god Anubis. And the reason Anubis is shown with a jackal's head is that jackals lived on the edge of the desert in ancient Egypt and were often seen around cemeteries, probably for quite insalubrious purposes, such as having a little munch on some of the bodies, but were therefore seen as the protectors, the guardians of the cemetery. So Anubis would be part of my after death experience in the same way that we see him in the Book of the Dead. Also, my body may be preserved to a certain extent because the very first mummified bodies in ancient Egypt were recovered from desert situations where the hot sand had naturally dried the body out. And we think this may have been partly what prompted the evolution of an artificial mummification process, which guaranteed that your body would be dried out. I would then go on the same journey as the 1%. I would then hope to arrive in an afterlife in the same way as the 1%. What I would not have were all the support mechanisms that the very rich were able to buy to put in their tomb. And we know that particular spells from the Book of the Dead are not just recorded on Book of the Dead papyrus, but also have been found on everyday objects. So the process that you went through and the sorts of phrases that you would need to say would have also been part of living Egyptian society. And so, for example, nowadays, many people, whatever their level of engagement with the church, would be able to say the Lord's Prayer. So spells from the Book of the Dead would probably have been spoken in temples, would have been known by people as incantations or sort of good luck sayings. So there would have been some knowledge of the process. What the Book of the Dead and your tomb did was it just gave you a bit of a better opportunity because you had all these extra guarantees built in to help you on your journey. So I would have still have hoped to go to the afterlife, and I would have hoped that I would have arrived there to live in the field of reeds or to join Ra on his journey across the sky. So we would have still got there, don't worry, we would have still got there, but without all the extra help that rich people got.
Thank you. Could you repeat the spell? Sorry, could you repeat or spell the name of the grave good manual labourer who did the work for the deceased? I didn't catch the name.
Oh, you mean the Shaddi?
Yeah, that's it.
Shabti. Those are the little figures. They're often blue. They're made from faience most often. I showed you a selection on the screen that had lots and lots of different Shaddis made from different materials. The one you most often see are the little blue faience ones, which are often about the same size as a hand. Shaddi is just the general name for all of them. They don't have individual names. They are a collective. They're a bit like a beehive. They're all little workers. So the deceased person is the queen of the beehive. And then the little Shaddi are all the workers who would have to spring to life and do any work that the gods asked of you. So in effect, it's a way of making sure that when you got to the afterlife, you could just sit there like, enjoying your afterlife and your game of Senate without having to be bothered with all that manual labour. Because remember, for the rich, that certainly would not have been part of their life when they were alive. So they were not expecting to have to do ploughing in the afterlife. So that's what the Shaddi are for.
Thank you. I'm just seeing if there's any other questions. I'll just give it a couple of seconds. Just otherwise to say that when we finish today, we're back on the 13th. So back on the 13th. So if you want to see those ones, just go to the web enroll in Camden and sign up for theirs, and I'll send you the invite out. I don't think there's any more questions. So thank you very much, Katharine. That was one of the special ones. That was really, really interesting.
I'm glad you enjoyed it. If anyone is particularly interested in some of the Book of the Dead scenes that we looked at, I agree, quite quickly on our talk today. If you go onto the British Museum website, and there's an area of the website that's collection online, and that's a database of lots of the objects in the British Museum. It's got a search box, and if you just put in Book of the Dead or papyrus, you will get a whole screen full of individual sheets from different books of the dead. We just looked at a selection of them today, but you will now have a few tools and a few points of reference that as you look at other people's books of the dead, you will start to spot the common themes that run through them. But also the slight variation. So it's also quite nice once you know about, say, the Hall of Truth and the Judgement scene, actually looking at what particular aspects someone has had built into their illustration. So sometimes you'll see sitting on top of the scales a little baboon, and baboons were considered to be representatives of the sun god in ancient Egypt, because at dawn, as the baboons woke up, they would all put up their hands in the real world and would screech. Ah! So the morning chorus of baboons was seen as the baboons greeting the sun god. So you'll often see little baboons at various points, and they're representative of the sun god. So looking for those little bits of detail is always fascinating.
Thank you, Katharine. And we'll see you all on the 13th.
Have a lovely end to November. See you in December. Bye.
Bye-bye.